Okay, we'll wait a few minutes. We got some people, I think, coming in. Welcome, everyone. We're going to wait just a few more minutes to see if we have other participants, and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we'll begin. Welcome, my name is Deborah Tollefson, and I'm a professor of philosophy here at the University of Memphis. And I'm also director of the Technology Serving Humanities Speaker Series. This is a new public lecture series launched by the U of M FedEx Institute of Technology. It focuses on the social, political, legal, ethical, and philosophical aspects of technology, with the aim of broadening our understanding of technology's vast impacts. National and international scholars from the humanities, fine arts, and communication, and the social sciences will be joining us this year. You can find out more about our series at the FedEx Institute of Technology website, and I'll place the link in the chat. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Christian List, professor of philosophy and decision theory at LMU Munich and co-director of the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy. He is also a visiting professor in the Department of Philosophy, Logic, and Scientific Method at the London School of Economics and a fellow of the British Academy. He works at the intersection of philosophy, economics, and political science, with a particular focus on individual and collective decision-making and the nature of intentional agency. He was awarded the 2010 Social Choice and Welfare Prize jointly with Franz Dietrich for his work on judgment aggregation, and the 2020 Joseph B. Gittler Award of the American Philosophical Association for his book, Why Free Will is Real. His talk today is titled Group Agency and Artificial Intelligence. Please join me in welcoming Dr. List.
So thank you very much for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I'm delighted to be part of this series. So the aim of this talk is to discuss the parallels between two phenomena that have recently received a fair amount of attention: the phenomenon of group agency on the one hand and that of artificial intelligence on the other. Both of these phenomena, in short, have to do with systems that are distinct from individual human beings, but which may nonetheless qualify as intentional agents and in some cases even as moral agents. So what I want to suggest is that these two phenomena, even though at first sight they seem quite different, raise some surprisingly similar philosophical and moral issues and challenges, and some insights that have been generated in debates about group agency over the last several years also carry over to debates about robots and computational systems. And I want to explore those parallels here. So the plan for this talk is to begin by introducing the two phenomena, and then I'll note once again what I take the key parallel between them to be. And then I'll devote a good amount of time to some normative lessons that can be learned from studying and this parallel and taking it seriously. So let's begin with the phenomenon of group agency. Now, this is the phenomenon that some organized collectives can constitute goal-directed agents in their own right over and above their individual members. Standard examples of group agents are commercial corporations, collegial courts, so an entity such as the Supreme Court, for instance, would be a group agent. Non-governmental organizations, so you could think of Greenpeace as a group agent, for instance, and even states in their entirety. I mean, we apply strategic reasoning and strategic considerations to the question of what would be a rational response for the United States to take in such and such strategic situation within its international relations, for instance. So we tend to ascribe beliefs, desires, and intentions to such entities, and we treat them as loci of action. And we also assess their actions in terms of standards of rationality, pretty much in the same way in which we assess individual actions by those standards. So just as we say, an individual person did something rational or irrational, so we say the same about the actions of a firm, for instance, or the action of a governmental organization. Now, at first sight, one might think that this ascription of agency and intentional attitudes to collectives is really nothing more than a metaphor, maybe a shorthand. It's a very informal way of speaking. So, for instance, one might think that when we say that Microsoft intends to increase profits, that's really just a shorthand for saying that the managers, board members, shareholders, and so on have this intention. But arguably, there are good social scientific reasons for treating group agency as not just metaphorical, but as a real phenomenon. And I'll just very quickly mention one kind of argument that one can give for treating group agency as a real phenomenon. This is an indispensability argument. Its first premise is that the ascription of intentional agency to certain organized collectives is indispensable for explaining their behavior. So this is a social scientific claim, which is well illustrated, for instance, by the theory of the firm in economics, by viewing firms as unitary rational agents that respond intelligibly to their environment and make decisions, take actions on that basis. We can make much better sense of the behavior of those firms than if we were to look only at individual members or employees or managers of those firms. The second premise is that if the ascription of some property to an entity is indispensable for explaining that entity's behavior, then we are at least provisionally warranted in assuming that the entity really has that property. That's a philosophical stance. It's sometimes called the naturalistic ontological attitude, but it's basically the sort of background idea that is also in place when physicists conclude that electromagnetism is a real phenomenon, because electromagnetism turns out to be an indispensable property that we need to postulate to explain certain observable phenomena in the world. Now, if you put these two premises together, then you immediately get the conclusion that we are at least provisionally warranted in assuming that the collectives in question really are intentional agents. And so for this reason, I think it's not just a sort of colloquial way of speaking when we say certain, let's say, corporations are intentional agents, but even from a social scientific perspective, we have a good justification for that view. And for an overview of the case for group agents, I'd like to take the opportunity to highlight Deborah Tollefson's 2015 book, Groups as Agents, which gives much more detail also for behind the case that one can make for being realist about group agency. Now let's next turn to artificial intelligence. This is the phenomenon that certain artificial, so for instance, computational or robotic systems, display intelligence, intentionality, and or autonomous agency, which is analogous in at least some respects to the intelligence or agency that we normally attribute to humans or other complex animals. Examples of AI systems are abundant by now. There are driverless cars, there are unmanned air vehicles, drones, especially those that operate autonomously and not just through some remote human pilot. Increasingly, we find care assistant robots in healthcare settings, autonomous financial trading software systems that autonomously make decisions to engage in market transactions, and so on and so on. And pretty much every day we read about new examples. Just recently, I read an article about a robot that is capable of autonomously assembling a piece of IKEA furniture, for instance. So some people distinguish between strong and weak forms of AI, and there are different ways in which you can draw those lines. But here I simply want to emphasize that my focus for this discussion is on AI systems that don't just solve certain number crunching tasks in a mechanical way. I mean, those are the kinds of systems that we can think of just as ordinary tools, nothing conceptually new about them. But my focus is on systems that we would describe as displaying a certain amount of intentionality or autonomy. So it's really systems that live up to some criterion of autonomous agency that interest me here in this discussion. Okay, so these are the two phenomena. So let's turn to the key parallel between them. Now, the key parallel is one that I already mentioned at the beginning. In both cases, we are dealing with systems distinct from individual human beings and other animals, which nonetheless qualify as intentional agents. And just to make this a little bit more precise, I want to just sketch one simple standard definition of intentional agency that I think makes it crystal clear why both group agents and AI systems fall into this category. So we can define an intentional agent as a system normally embedded within some environment that meets at least three conditions. And this definition and these three conditions in many ways go back even to the philosophy of David Hume, or to some ideas we can find in David Hume, but a prominent development of it can be found, for instance, in the work of Michael Bradman, and in some of my own work with Philip Pettit in relation to group agency. We've also made use of these conditions, but I mean, they are completely standard. They are not in any way sort of gerrymandered for my analysis here. The first condition is that the system has representational states, which encode its what we call beliefs about how things are in the environment. The second condition is that the system has motivational states, which encode its desires as to how it would like things to be in the environment. And then finally, the system has a capacity to systematically interact with its environment in pursuit of its desires on the basis of its beliefs. Now, just to give you a very simple example, I have a belief that I have a water bottle next to me here. I might have a desire to drink a bit of water, and then I've now acted, thereby interacted with the environment in pursuit of this desire to drink water on the basis of my beliefs. So this is just a simple way of illustrating how we, for instance, meet this belief desire structure for agency. Now, you could also think of some extremely simple systems that have this kind of structure. A sort of limiting case example, also sometimes given by Daniel Dennett in a famous work, is a thermostat. So a thermostat has some beliefs about what the current temperature is in the room. Maybe it has some desires, preset, of course, about a target temperature, and then it operates the heating or the air conditioning on this basis. So you might even say a thermostat would qualify as an intentional agent. But that might be a bit of an over-ascription. In the case of a thermostat, it's clearly no longer indispensable to view the thermostat in this way. You can have a simpler mechanical story about how the thermostat works. But in the human case, very clearly, viewing humans as falling under these conditions is also extremely useful from an explanatory perspective. Now, consistently with these conditions, agents can vary considerably in their capacities and sophistication. I don't need to tell you that humans have many psychological states and capacities beyond beliefs and desires. Think of emotions, hopes, fears, and so on. But nonetheless, systems ranging from non-human animals to robots and organized collectives can, in principle, satisfy the conditions for agency as well. Conceptually, there is clearly no barrier for, let's say, a commercial corporation to qualify as an intentional agent. And indeed, that's precisely how the theory of the firm in economics models firms. Or likewise, for an autonomous robot to do so. They each display this belief, desire, structure captured by these three conditions. And this is also the perspective that is adopted by many social sciences across a variety of disciplines. In fact, some theories of international relations, the so-called realist theories, adopt this perspective even towards states in their entirety. But this perspective is also adopted by the study of artificial intelligence and computer science. So if you take the very influential AI textbook by Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig, for instance, you find that they define the subject of AI as, and I quote, the study of agents that receive percepts from the environment and perform actions. So there you have it, AI as agency. Now, in fact, I'd be inclined to think that group agents such as corporations can even be viewed as special cases of AI systems where the hardware supporting the artificial intelligence is simply social rather than electronic. So it's an AI system, not so much with an electronic wiring structure underpinning it, but with a social wiring structure. The logician Rohit Parikh has actually coined the term social software to refer to an idea along these lines. So, not necessarily applied to group agents as such, but I think the term captures the idea quite nicely. So, group agents, in a sense, as socially implemented AI systems. Okay, so a lot more could be said about this parallel. But I want to spend some time and talk about normative lessons here. And I'll look at two sets of lessons, lessons for responsibility and lessons for rights and moral status. So let's begin with responsibility. Now, one respect where I think group agency and AI really raise some similar challenges concerns precisely the issue of who bears moral as well as legal responsibility for their actions. So it's very widely recognized that group agents, so states, for instance, corporations, but also other large organizations, think of large media organizations, for instance, have a lot of power in the social world. And in principle, they can also cause significant harms. I mean, they can also, of course, do much good. So we have perfectly good reasons for having those entities in the social world. But think of universities. They do a lot of great stuff and they're group agents. But corporate entities clearly can cause significant harms. And in the case of such collectively caused harms, it's sometimes hard to identify or pinpoint one or several individuals to whom we can then reasonably attribute all of the responsibility for that harmful outcome. So I'll give you an example that Philip Pettit has given. In 1987, the Herald of Free Enterprise, a ferry operating in the English Channel, sank on its route from Zeebrugge in Belgium to Dover in England, drowning nearly 200 people. This was one of the biggest ferry disasters ever in the English Channel. Now, an official inquiry at the time found that the company operating the ferry, a company named Townsend Torreson, was extremely sloppy. It had poor routines and terrible safety procedures. Really an awful company in many ways. As one commentator put it, from top to bottom, the body corporate was infected with the disease of sloppiness. I mean, also notice the sort of anthropomorphism in this characterization. The body corporate was infected with the disease of sloppiness. Now, despite complex legal proceedings at the time, no one was found legally responsible to what seemed to be an intuitively appropriate extent. The same commentator expressed this problem as follows, writing, the primary requirement of finding an individual who was liable stood in the way of attaching any significance to the organizational sloppiness. So, I mean, if only individuals were on the radar screen of the law as potentially, liable agents, then there was just no way to appropriately attribute blame or responsibility for this sort of systemic feature of the organizational sloppiness. So there was a shortfall in legal responsibility because the ferry company wasn't treated as a locus of responsible agency. Now, in general, the sum total of individual responsibility may sometimes fail to do justice to the full amount of harm caused. The Herald of Free Enterprise just being one example where this sort of thing happened. And intuitively, then we feel that there is a responsibility gap. And often, at least, we can avoid such responsibility gaps only by recognizing that group agents themselves can be held corporately responsible over and above their individual members. And that's a widely recognized point in the very large literature on corporate responsibility. I mean, going back to the classic work of Peter French already. Now, similarly, responsibility gaps may arise due to harms caused by AI systems. So these systems are increasingly ubiquitous. I've already mentioned some examples. You find them in areas as diverse as transportation, self-driving vehicles, for instance, or in aviation. You find them in the military, drones, autonomous weapon systems in financial markets, autonomous trading systems, and in medicine increasingly with care assistance, but also diagnostic technology. And again, the degree to which these systems fulfill autonomous tasks and even begin to take high stakes decisions on their own, that's also increasing more and more year after year. So as AI systems operate autonomously in high stakes environments, the occurrence of some harms is in practice inevitable. I mean, we've already seen accidents, for instance, caused by self-driving cars in some kind of autonomous driving mode. Now, due to the system's design, which may involve, for instance, opaque deep learning mechanisms, at least some of those harms may not be foreseeable. So it's not always clear that we can really attribute all the blame or responsibility to human operators, human manufacturers, human owners, or regulators. I mean, sometimes it might be that there were humans involved who failed with respect to certain due diligence duties, or who were negligent or reckless, or I mean, wherever there are humans, these kinds of things can happen. And when this happens, attributing responsibility is of course appropriate. But simply due to the complexity, opacity, lack of transparency of how some of those systems ultimately function in unexpected situations, there is inevitably a measure of unpredictability that goes along with the increasing level of autonomy of those systems. And in such cases, it's at least conceivable that the sum total of human responsibility occasionally fails to do justice to the full amount of the harm caused, just like it can happen in the corporate case. And we would then also face a responsibility gap. Again, something that has been noted by many people working on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And this raises the question of whether we can avoid such gaps by attributing responsibility to the AI systems themselves over and above individual human operators, for instance, or human owners or manufacturers, and what exactly this would mean. Now, I want to emphasize that even if we entertain the possibility of attributing responsibility to AI systems, not just to humans who are somehow involved, this doesn't absolve those relevant humans of their responsibility for certain actions. So just as in the corporate case, where both the CEO and the corporate entity could be held responsible, we could also, of course, recognize that both some relevant humans and the AI system can be loci of responsibility. But importantly, as in the case of group agency, it would be a mistake to simply derive the conclusion that a particular system should be assigned responsibility from the premise that this would help us avoid responsibility gaps. I mean, that would be a non sequitur. Just from concluding that we'd otherwise get a responsibility gap, it doesn't follow that the system qualifies as a responsible agent. That's wishful thinking. I mean, maybe you think when a hurricane destroys some buildings and causes terrible damage, that of course that's extremely regrettable, and maybe we might feel there is a responsibility gap here, but certainly from this it wouldn't follow that the hurricane is a locus of responsible agency. So before we assign responsibilities to some entity, we need to make sure that some conditions for this are met. So we must independently establish the system's fitness to be held responsible. That's sort of a phrasing that again, Philip Pettit sometimes uses. So what are the conditions that a system must meet for fitness to be held responsible? And here I invoke conditions that come from my own work on group agency with Philip Pettit. So the first condition is the moral agency condition. This is the requirement that the system in question is a moral agent, not just an intentional agent. This means the system has the capacity in principle to make more normative judgments about its choices. So this is a condition met by human beings. We are moral agents, not just intentional agents. But for instance, primates are intentional agents, in fact, very sophisticated ones. But arguably, they don't have the capacity to make the sorts of normative judgments that would be involved in the moral agency condition. Secondly, there's an epistemic condition. The system must have the information and access to evidence needed for assessing its choices normatively. And then finally, the control condition, which says that the agent in question has the control required for choosing between its options. And only when a system meets all three conditions, then can we say that this system is fit to be held responsible. So that's sort of the yardstick. So we can then ask which kinds of systems meet these conditions. And the answer, in short, is very much an empirical matter. So it's an empirical question whether a given system, biological, electronic, or social, meets these three conditions. I think in the biological case, at this point, only humans meet these conditions. The moral agency condition would clearly exclude non-human animals. In the social case, Philip Pettit and I and others working on group agency have come to the conclusion that suitably organized group agents can meet all of these conditions, the moral agency, epistemic condition, and also the control condition. And one might then actually suggest that society via its regulatory authorities should permit the creation of powerful new group agents, such as corporations, organizations, and so on, operating in high-stakes environments, only if structures are in place to ensure their fitness to be held responsible. So before an organization can officially get approval for its articles of association, for instance, on this proposal, the organization would need to show that it qualifies not just as a goal-directed intentional agent, but that it has certain moral agency mechanisms in place. And I mean, the devil is in the details. One can then have a debate about how exactly this is implemented and what distinguishes a group agent that is a moral agent from one that is a mere intentional agent. But I think it would be good regulatory practice to push corporations, for instance, in this direction. And indeed, if we look at debates about corporate social responsibility, for instance, these debates can actually be framed precisely in these terms, in terms of asking what corporate organizations need to do to fulfill certain moral agency standards. Okay, let's move on to AI. So here I think it's also an empirical question whether a given AI system meets these conditions for fitness to be held responsible. And there is a growing research program on what we might call engineering moral machines, which can be viewed as an attempt to find ways of implementing some form of moral agency in AI systems. There are tons of technical challenges here, and this whole field is very much in its infancy. But conceptually, I want to suggest there is absolutely no reason why an AI system could not satisfy these three conditions for fitness to be held responsible that I've stated. So in particular, the moral agency condition, not just the intentional one. And so in analogy to this regulatory proposal for group agents, one might consider something similar for AI systems, roughly along the following lines. This principle would say that society, again, via its regulatory authorities, should permit the use of new AI systems, at least those in high-stakes environments, which autonomously make high-stakes decisions, only if structures are in place to ensure their fitness to be held responsible. As a sort of backup, maybe there could be some kind of full liability transfer to certain legal representatives if it is really strictly impossible to implement fitness to be held responsible in the system itself, and if we nonetheless have very strong reasons for using this system. But the basic idea here is also, before you get an operating permission for an AI system to act highly autonomously in a high stakes setting, certain moral agency requirements must be met. And the technical structures for achieving this may include, but they need not be restricted to, things like some non-negotiable ethical constraints on a system's behavior that are sort of hardwired via coding, programming into the system's behavior. An explicit implementation of moral norms in an AI system, for instance, via machine learning techniques, in the same way in which we can teach AI systems, for instance, to read and decode chest X-rays via some form of supervised learning. In principle, one could also use morally coded learning databases to use machine learning techniques then to implement moral norms in an AI system. And again, there's much work to be done, but there is a feasible research program here to move in this direction. And another proposal by Winfield and Giotka, AI researchers, is an ethical black box. This is a device that would continuously record the decision-making processes in such an AI system, much like a black box in an airplane, so that if something goes wrong with the decision-making and some terrible harm results, one has a certain form of ex-post transparency and is able to unpack and account for what exactly happened and what went wrong. Okay, so let me finally look at some lessons for rights and moral status. Now, if we regard both group agents and AI systems as agents of their own, should we then also give them certain rights? Should we agree, for instance, with the Citizens United decision of the US Supreme Court, which gives relatively broad free speech rights via monetary spending to commercial corporations? And should we perhaps then also extend such free speech rights to certain, autonomous systems that engage in autonomous speech, maybe via social media or other internet channels. Now, in previous work on group agency, Philip Pettit and I asserted a normative asymmetry between individual agents and group agents. So in particular, we argued that while group agents should be held responsible for their corporate actions, they shouldn't be given the same rights as individuals. They should be there should be much more significant checks on their behavior than in just the case of human individuals. So we insisted that group agents should be given only those rights that are defensible within normative individualism, and often should be subject to especially strict checks and controls. I mean, some rights make perfect sense in the case of a corporate entity. So, for instance, it makes sense for corporations to be able to own property and to enter into certain contractual arrangements, because that enables them to fulfill their function, which by and large is useful for society. But according to this proposal, that does not carry over to the entire repertoire of rights and liberties that we qua humans and qua individual human citizens of our societies enjoy. Now, at the time, we were then criticized, for instance, by Ray Briggs, for not sufficiently justifying this normative asymmetry between individuals and groups. One criticism was that this asymmetry seemed quite hard to defend in light of this functionalist belief desire account of agency, according to which, as I already emphasized, agency is very much a multiply realizable phenomenon which can be implemented in humans, which can be implemented in non-human animals, in corporations, and in AI systems. And if we really think that these are all perfectly fine cases of agency, as this present analysis seems to suggest, then on the face of it, it's not completely obvious why then when it comes to right, we can immediately draw these sharp distinctions. So that's sort of the criticism here. So why be normative individualists if we are functionalists about agency? Why not assign rights whenever a system, whether individual or collective or artificial or robotic, whatever, meets the functional requirements for moral agency, for instance? And what I want to suggest is that a key difference in moral significance between individuals and group agents stems from their difference with respect to consciousness and sentience more broadly. So individual human beings are phenomenally conscious, they are sentient, they have experiences, they experience pleasure and pain, there's a first personal perspective on the world to them, while group agents arguably lack those features. They are not phenomenally conscious, they haven't got an experience of an eye, they don't have a subjective pain feeling or pleasure feeling or any of these. So one might say that only phenomenally conscious agents, or those with a potential for phenomenal consciousness, can have non-derivative rights. That is, rights that are not justified merely instrumentally in terms of their usefulness for something else that is of fundamental significance. So the rights that my university enjoys are justified instrumentally by reference to their usefulness for some other greater good, maybe for society. But humans, on the other hand, have non-derivative rights, which we don't need to justify by reference to the usefulness for anything else. We don't need to give an instrumental justification for them, but we have non-derivative rights just by virtue of our human status. And so on this picture, one of the distinguishing features, I know it's the only one that sort of sets us apart, is the presence or capacity, or at least potential, for phenomenal consciousness. So phenomenal consciousness on this picture would be a necessary, perhaps not sufficient, but certainly necessary condition for having non-derivative rights. And group agents wouldn't meet that condition. Group agents could still have derivative rights, like the right to own property, as I already indicated, but not rights of this non-derivative sort, rights that are based on some kind of intrinsic moral status that we humans enjoy. Now, would this criterion yield the same verdict for AI systems as for group agents? And here the answer depends very much on the AI system in question. Given the time constraints I have here, I just want to make two very, very brief remarks before wrapping up. So on the one hand, I want to note that there is no reason to think that current AI systems, which are based on conventional computational architectures, even remotely meet the preconditions for phenomenal consciousness. I think you can quite safely assume that, you know, the sorts of AI systems that we have here and now in the world, I mean, they might be fantastic at certain computational tasks and do certain stuff very well autonomously, but phenomenal consciousness, the sort of thing that we have, or that, you know, dogs and cats and other non-human animals have, that's not something that AI systems of the present technology seem to even remotely have. And in fact, if there are questions about this, I'm very happy to give you the sort of neuroscience reasons that I think underpin this judgment. And for this reason, current AI systems are at most like corporations in their moral status. On the other hand, there is at least a theoretical possibility that future so-called biomorphic AI systems might become phenomenally conscious. So biomorphic AI systems would be AI systems whose computational architecture is structurally much more based on something that looks like the human cortex, with a neural network structure with this sort of very rich interconnectivity inspired by the wiring of the human brain. And then to the extent that it's those structural features that also underpin phenomenal consciousness in us humans, we might have conceivably reasons to think that such biomorphic AI systems might have some form of consciousness or proto-consciousness. I mean, we're not even remotely there yet, but it's a possibility that we cannot rule out at this point. And at that point, and that's sort of very much uncharted terrain, AI systems might conceivably acquire a stronger moral status than group agents. They might be not just moral agents, but possibly genuine objects of moral concern. We're not there yet, but it's a sort of theoretical possibility that is well worth thinking through, not just from a sort of science fiction perspective, but also from a broader philosophical one. So just to wrap up, I think we can conclude that agency is a multiply realizable phenomenon which admits at least three kinds of hardware: biological, as in the paradigmatic human and animal case; social, as in the corporate case; and artificial or engineered, as in the AI case. And instead of investigating each of these cases in isolation, I think it's useful to identify the lessons that the study of agency in any one of these cases yields for the others. Now, since both group agents and AI systems are artificial systems that constitute goal-directed agents, they raise some similar philosophical and moral questions. And in particular, in both cases, we're dealing with agents beyond the human individual. And it's then important for us to come to terms with the fact that in the increasingly complex and technologically advanced societies in which we live, the loci of agency go well beyond individual human beings. That's, for me, one of the most important lessons we need to learn here. The loci of agency in our contemporary social world are not at all restricted to individual humans, but there are these larger social entities that are agents, and increasingly AI systems too. And we must then ensure that our normative concepts and categories, so for instance, our criteria for responsibility and moral status, can handle the presence of such diverse loci of agency in the world. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Liss. That was great. We will take questions. You can post those in the chat. Actually, there is a comment already in the chat. Christian, can you see the comments?
I can see the comments, but it might be easiest if you read out which ones you would like me to address and in which order, and then I'll speak to them.
Okay, great. I'll do that. Dr. Hughes said there are systems that simulate or emulate consciousness, one by Stan Franklin here at the University of Memphis, based on Barr's theory. I think that's a comment about the consciousness question.
Yeah, so indeed, I think even at this point, researchers in areas such as computational neuroscience are working on computer systems that simulate or emulate certain salient functions of the human brain, and including mechanisms that are presumably implicated in consciousness. And the reference here is perhaps to something like the global workspace theory. So this is the theory according to which the consciousness supporting condition is the presence of a global workspace in which information is pooled and then made available in a sort of multi-purpose way for a whole bunch of different functional units. So I think this is a highly functionalist account of consciousness, which I think probably does quite well at capturing the functional role that consciousness plays in relation to cognition. So I don't doubt that we can simulate this at this point. I'm sort of less sure about whether that kind of criterion is already sufficient for phenomenal consciousness, the sort of consciousness that Thomas Nagel had in mind when he famously asked the question, what is it like to be a bat? Or when he said, consciousness is the feature that there is like to be a particular entity. And it's less clear to me that this fairly informational criterion of consciousness, which we can simulate, already gives rise to these what is it like feelings. But I mean, in general, I do take the point. Computational neuroscience is making a lot of progress, and we most definitely cannot rule out that at some point we will really have systems that quite plausibly emulate or implement the preconditions for some form of phenomenal consciousness.
Okay, any other questions? Okay. So David Gray says we're moral agents and we have consciousness, but the arguments seem to be we are moral agents because we have consciousness. I take this to be phenomenal consciousness. Why would that be the case?
I don't want to argue that phenomenal consciousness is a necessary condition for moral agency. So the conditions for moral agency that I defended and would defend are ones that basically add the capacity for some form of normative or moral cognition to the other basic agential capacities. So for a system to qualify as a moral agent, it has to be an intentional agent in line with these belief, desire, intention type of conditions that are introduced. And then in addition, to make the system a moral agent, not just an intentional one, the system must have the capacity for normative cognition. And I take this to be very much a sort of functional capacity, one that could be implemented in a suitably organized cooperation with the right kinds of ethics and compliance committees as well. And it could, in principle, also be implemented in an AI system in which we've made use of, let's say, some of these machine learning techniques to implement, for instance, moral decision-making criteria. So in principle, those kinds of systems, just based on certain cognitive capacities, might qualify as moral agents. And that's sort of weaker than saying that those systems are also intrinsic objects of moral concern. Sometimes people use the term moral patient to refer to such systems. So we humans are importantly not just moral agents, but we are also moral patients. We are sort of objects of moral concern with intrinsic value. And likewise, we want to say that, let's say, cats and dogs are not moral agents because they lack the capacities for normative cognition, but they are certainly moral patients in the sense that they are objects of moral concern. We ought to care about them, and we have certain duties to treat them well, and so on. So what I suggested is that phenomenal consciousness might be a necessary condition for being that kind of moral patient, an object of, in particular, sort of intrinsic moral concern, but phenomenal consciousness, and in particular, more specifically, I suggested that phenomenal consciousness might be a necessary condition for having non-derivative rights. But I've not suggested that phenomenal consciousness is already necessary for moral agency. And otherwise, it would sort of immediately then also undermine the case for saying that corporations can be fit to be held responsible.
Okay, good. Here's some other questions. The sensitivity of AI systems to moral codes of ethics is possibly greater than corporations government organizations, civic organizations, and politicians. How can these be put on an even playing field?
I think I didn't catch the very beginning of this. Would you mind reading it out one more time?
Sure. The sensitivity of AI systems to moral codes of ethics is possibly greater than corporations, government organizations, civic organizations, and politicians. I think the point is that, yeah, that AI might be better at doing this than people are, or groups of people. How can these be put on an even playing field?
Okay, so I think that depends very much on the AI systems. I would agree that if we were really good at, for instance, using machine learning techniques to implement moral decision-making in AI systems, for instance, via certain techniques of supervised learning, then it's conceivable that an AI system could be trained to be a relatively good moral decision maker, and maybe a much better moral decision maker than, for instance, a commercial corporation or a political party or some other entity in the social world. I mean, in principle, of course, that would be a that would be a good thing, and that might, if that were true, it would even suggest that the kind of regulatory principle or regulatory standard that I suggested would be maybe easier to meet in the AI case than in the in the corporate case. So I would welcome this. I mean, of course, in the corporate case, in principle, we already now have the technology to make corporate entities good moral agents, and much depends, not so much on the technology, but much depends on the sort of human and institutional goodwill behind it. I mean, if we or if society wants to make the corporate entities that it regulates more moral decision makers, in principle, we do have the tools for achieving this. Whereas in the case of AI, some advances maybe in engineering, computer science, and systems design, and so on will still be needed. But I mean, I still find it instructive to compare those two cases, because precisely in both of these cases, we've got these artificial agents, and then we have to figure out, how can we make them moral decision makers that live up to certain responsibilities that they have, especially in light of the fact that in principle they can do an awful lot of damage.
Right. Okay, here's another. Beliefs, intentions, and behaviors are fuzzy or invisible to humans. They are more explicit in organizations and also more explicit in AI. So why do individuals have a priority?
So the question is, what sort of priority do we mean? I mean, it is sometimes suggested that some of these relatively theoretically idealized notions of rational agency are actually those that philosophers discuss when they talk about agency, are often better instantiated, or maybe better is the wrong word, but more clearly instantiated in, for instance, firms in the marketplace than in individual humans. So it might be that a firm in the marketplace, a group agent, is more similar to the sort of classically rational agent, the Homo economicus, than the individual consumer in the market. So that could very well be, and it could also likewise be that the case that AI systems satisfy certain conditions for rational agency in a particularly sharp way. But I would want to argue that the concern that we have for humans, and maybe the sort of moral priority that we give to individual humans, for instance, by assigning stronger rights to individual humans, not due to the extent to which humans are fully or only boundedly rational. That's not the sort of key factor, but the key factor is precisely that humans have first personal experiences, they have autonomous life plans, they have emotions, they have a rich life, and it's precisely those features that make it important for us to care, especially about humans. And it's also those features that make it a lot more important to care about the well-being of your dog, for instance, than about the well-being of your Tesla. Precisely because one big difference between your dog and your Tesla is that your dog is conscious and experiences pleasure and pain, and your Tesla car, despite having certain autonomy capacities, arguably doesn't do so. So yeah, so for this reason, I again want to emphasize this point about phenomenal consciousness that at this point sets humans, but also some other non-human animals, very clearly apart from both corporate entities and AI systems.
Can you speak to the anecdotal accounts of AI showing bias and predispositions, or some would say prejudiced?
Yeah, so in fact, there has been a lot of research recently into problems of algorithmic bias. So increasingly, algorithmic decision-making systems are being used for certain high-stakes decisions. For instance, in the United States, some systems have been used to make recidivism predictions in judicial contexts, for instance, to then assist judges in deciding whether someone's prison sentence should be cut short or not. With respect to those, so one such system is called Compass, for instance. And with respect to those systems, it's sometimes been shown that they display certain biases in their decision making, for instance, having differential error rates depending on the specific demographic group to which they are applied. And that is a serious concern, and it raises a lot of difficult challenges, for how we should design those systems. Is there something wrong with the training data sets that we use in order to do the machine learning of those systems? Might there be some specifications of the systems themselves that, irrespective of the training database, would lead to certain biases? And of course, finally, is it even acceptable that in high stakes judicial decisions, those kind of black box number crunching systems should be used? And I think I take those challenges very, very seriously, and I think they illustrate precisely the sorts of concerns that have also motivated my talk here, namely that as soon as such autonomous systems are engaged in fairly autonomous decision making in high stakes settings, they get entangled in often sort of morally problematic decision making, and then we really need to figure out how, beyond the technological number crunching capacities, we can somehow impose moral constraints on those systems.
Just to follow up to that response, biases in AI systems are typically lower than bias in human decision-making. Does it make sense to routinely make bias comparisons?
I don't know exactly what is meant by lower here. So I guess we then need to look exactly at the performance of different systems. We'd have to look at the performance of human decision makers as compared with algorithmic decision systems, and probably not all human decision makers are exactly the same in this respect, and also not all algorithmic systems are the same in this respect. I mean, if it could be shown that biases are less bad in the case of certain algorithmic systems than in the human case, that would be an interesting finding, and it would support perhaps the use of those systems as compared to the more biased humans. But any residual bias is obviously a cause for concern, and we'd need to figure out what is the correct way to quantify and measure and establish bias. And once we've done this, we need to figure out how we can minimize it as much as possible, because especially in high stakes settings such as the judicial examples that I gave, we owe it to the people involved that we make unbiased decisions.
Okay, any other questions? I don't see any. Well, let's thank our, oh, wait, there's one new message. Okay, yeah, David, there's time. David Gray says, I like Liz's point about how we don't hold AIs responsible in the case that we have a moral explanatory gap. But with current AI embedded within corporations, where the AI is used to provide services, it seems we do hold corporations using AI morally responsible for not understanding how machine learning works, for instance. The question just asked about bias speaks to this concern. These seem to be not moral failings. Sorry, it just shifted, went something. These seem to be moral failings of ignorance, not understanding problems with data sets or training protocols, as opposed to malice. But I'm having problems seeing how making AI more independent, but still designed by us, will make it responsible.
Okay, so undoubtedly, some also in the example of algorithmic bias, some of these biases indeed are not in any way the result of malice, but are indeed the result of design flaws, and maybe unanticipated design flaws. But of course, nonetheless, when this kind of bias happens, we need to take it seriously. But the reason why it might still make sense then to introduce some form of responsibility for harms caused by the decisions of AI systems, even if there was no one's malice involved, even if every human or organization involved was sort of perfectly well-intentioned, is not just that we want to close possible responsibility gaps, but also that we want to incentivize good systems design. So, I mean, imagine if an organization that uses AI, or a human who uses AI, can sort of hide behind their ignorance of the black box of the system, or hide behind the opacity of the underlying algorithm, and say, I tried my best. This is just a kind of unfortunate, unforeseeable accident that has happened here, which led to this sort of harmful output of the system. Therefore, it's not my fault. It's no one's fault. We must just treat it like an avalanche or a hurricane or some kind of unfortunate stochastic shock, but not as the result of responsible agency. If that were possible, we'd almost run the risk of incentivizing organizations to hide behind the actions of harmful AI systems in order to avoid bearing responsibility. And so it then seems to me that we'd either, to have incentives against this kind of approach, we'd either need to make sure that there is some kind of liability transfer from the AI system to the organization, so the organization still bears liability, maybe on the model of strict liability regimes in the food industry or something like this, in order to incentivize the organization to make sure that the system functions well. Or alternatively, we'd need to have some form of a responsibility of the AI system itself, and that can also have practical consequences, because it could mean that unless an AI system is appropriately fit to be held responsible, the system would not get the operating certificate, and we'd not be able to use it in practice. And again, that kind of rule would then incentivize the development and use of well-behaved systems that display morally compliant behavior. So this is perhaps an aspect that I didn't emphasize that much in the talk earlier on. There is not just the rationale of holding systems sort of exposed accountable for their actions, or holding agents exposed accountable for the actions that they did in the past. Of course, that's one important aspect of responsibility. But there is also a very strong developmental rationale for expecting both group agents, corporations, and also AI systems to be fit to be held responsible, because the developmental rationale is precisely that by having a responsibility regime in place, we hopefully incentivize better patterns of decision-making behavior in the future.
Great. Any other questions? We're just at 4 o'clock now, a little bit over. Well, let's thank Dr. List for joining us today. Thank you so much, Christian. It's been great to see you. I just want to pitch our talk. We're having another talk in our series on Tuesday, March 15th. I hope you'll all join us. It's by Andrew Ferguson. It's the title is Surveillance and the Tyrant Test: How to Respond to the Threat of Big Data Policing. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Thanks a lot.